Howdy, today on Flippin Science we compared steam turbines, photovoltaics and fuel cells. So science understandings we're going to look at. Most electricity is generated using fuels to drive steam turbines. Energy can also be generated using PV cells, photovoltaic cells, and directly from oxidation of fuels using galvanic cells. Explain the advantages and disadvantages of direct energy generation, so photovoltaic and fuel cells compared to steam turbines. So in Australia and worldwide, most electricity is produced by burning of fuel, and normally coal and gas. Here's a picture showing the live electricity generation this morning. If we look at South Australia, it was mainly gas that was producing electricity with a little bit of wind and a little bit of solar from people's houses. If we look at other states, we can see that New South Wales and Queensland is burning black coal is generating a large amount of the energy. If we look at Victoria, it's burning brown coal. The way a coal or gas-fired power station works is you take your coal, you burn it, or your gas, and you burn it. That's used to heat up water. So water passes past a boiler. That water gets turned into steam. The steam travels at high speed through a turbine, and here's a picture of one of the turbines down here. That turbine is connected to a generator, and that turns a magnet near some wires, and that generates electrical current, and that's the electricity that we use. The steam is then condensed back down into water, and then that can cycle back through. This process generates a lot of heat, and we'll look at what happens to that heat a bit later on. So, some advantages of steam turbines. As long as you can supply a fuel, either coal or gas, the electricity is available, so it's not reliant on the sun or the weather, which is different to photovoltaics or wind energy, for example. It provides a good baseload power. What that means is you have a constant supply of power being generated. Then if you're using renewables, then you might not need to use as much of the baseload. But if the renewables aren't available, due to there being no wind or no sun, then you still generate enough electricity to keep things running. It's a very mature technology. That means we've been using it for a very long time. We're making small improvements here and there in terms of efficiency gains and generator designs, the turbine designs, and looking at capturing some of the carbon that's coming out of these things. But the technology is quite mature. It also uses energy-dense fuels that we have a reasonable amount of. We have lots of coal in Australia. A couple of years ago I heard we had about 200 years worth of coal available left to us, in Victoria at least, to generate electricity from. So we have lots of that fuel still around. Disadvantages of using steam turbines, they release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the burning. This down here, this is Hazelwood Power Station that isn't running anymore. This is in Victoria. So this is near where my mum grew up. It was the dirtiest coal-fired power station in Australia. It was the least efficient, and the amount of emissions from this power station were quite high. You can get sulfur pollution from burning coal in particular, and that sulfur can produce sulfur dioxides, which then leads into sulfur trioxides, which then leads into acid rain production. Radiation is also released from coal, which is interesting. So there's a lot of radiation released from the burning of coal too into the local environment. In South Australia we're dealing with an increase in the use of gas domestically in Australia, increasing the price of gas used for electricity production. So what that means is, because the price has jumped, the cost of electricity has also jumped, and that's having an issue on lots of people. The efficiency of burning coal or gas isn't particularly high. It's around about 20 to 30%. So the amount of energy you get stored versus the amount of electricity you get out isn't particularly high. We saw previously that it generates a lot of heat, this process, and that's where a lot of the waste energy is, in heat. So that can be released into waterways as a way of dissipating that heat. And that's what's happening down here. So next to the Hazelwood Power Station, they've got this thing called the Hazelwood Pondage, which is a big reservoir, essentially, where the hot water from the plant goes in and warms it up. So the temperature of that was 17, 18 degrees pretty much all year round. So you've got some almost tropical species growing in the Hazelwood Pondage. So that can affect the organisms that would have lived there previously. Now that they've turned the power station off, it's starting to cool down, and that's causing massive deaths of the fish that are living there. So let's look at photovoltaic cells. So photovoltaic cells, which are abbreviated to PV cells, they produce electricity directly. So there's no moving parts here, it's just the sun hits the panel and that generates electricity. The way it works, the physics is a little bit complicated. Light hits the photovoltaic cells, that causes electrons to be dislodged, and then the electrons are collected by wires. So where is it? We should have it here. So metal conductors down here. The electrons are conducted by wires into a circuit, and that circuit is used to do, that circuit is the electricity that you can use out of it. So here we have 0.58 for this panel, volts being produced. And that generates the current. The electrons are then returned, the gaps are regenerated, and you're ready to start again. So let's talk about some advantages of photovoltaic cells. The energy source is free. You don't have to pay for coal, you don't have to pay for gas. Sunlight is free. Over time, the cost of photovoltaic cells is decreasing, and that's leading to an increase in the uptake domestically. So a lot of people are putting solar panels on their houses. In South Australia, it's about 50% of houses have solar panels on them. So one of the reasons for that is the government was suggesting people take them up by providing money based on the amount of electricity that people are generating. That's dropped away, but the cost of the panels has also decreased, so people are still installing solar panels on their roofs. And one of the reasons for that, it works very well in the Australian climate. Depending on where you are in Australia, we have lots of sunlight and moderate temperatures, so that means the solar panels work reasonably efficiently. As part of talking about the cost, we need to talk about the cost compared to say coal or gas, and we can see here that solar, which is solar photovoltaic, which is this column here, it is still higher than coal, which is conventional coal down here, not too much worse. So hydro is quite good in some ways, but solar photovoltaic is not too much more expensive these days. Part of that is the dropping costs of the panels means that the panels can pay for themselves in around about 5 years or so, depending on how big your system is and where you live in Australia. And the environmental costs paid off at about that time too, so we'll talk about the energy cost that goes into producing a photovoltaic cell. But the financial costs also pays themselves off. There's very little maintenance since there's no moving parts, you just have to make sure the panel's relatively clean. And while it's producing electricity, there's no pollution being produced. Now let's look at some disadvantages of photovoltaic cells. If a homeowner is setting a system up, it's expensive in the initial outlay. So if you're putting up a 5 kilowatt system at the moment, that'll cost about $5,000 to $6,000. And you don't get the money back from the government that you used to from feed-in tariffs. The energy cost of producing a solar panel is quite high, because one of the aspects of it is you need to produce silicon. Silicon exists in nature, but it's combined usually with oxygen and silicon dioxide. They use very high purity sand to produce the silicon wafers that you need for the solar panels. To do that, you need to melt the sand at really high temperatures, put in the seed crystal, and then you draw it out really, really slowly while you're rotating it. And that's how you make your silica ingot. So you need to melt the sand, which requires high energy costs in order to do that. And it also releases a lot of fossil fuels, usually depending on your energy source. The solar panels aren't very efficient, so the ones you'll have on your roof are about 10% efficient. So that means the amount of light hitting the solar panel versus the amount of electricity you get out of it is about 10%. There was a drive to increase the efficiency of solar panels, but it's easier now just to produce more solar panels at a cheaper cost rather than working on increasing efficiencies. The cost is still not cheaper than fossil fuels per kilowatt hour, per megawatt hour. So it is still cheaper to burn coal. It's not necessarily cheaper to burn gas, but it is cheaper to burn coal to generate electricity. And it is very reliant on the weather being nice and clear and sunny in order to generate the electricity. So you can't use photovoltaic cells at night, it just doesn't work. Whereas with coal power, you can burn coal all day, every day, and you get electricity out of it. Now we're going to talk about fuel cells. So we're going to go into fuel cells in a bit more detail in another video. But they're a galvanic cell that produces electricity via redox reactions. You oxidize one substance at an anode, and that produces electrons. Those electrons pass through an external circuit, and that's where you use your electricity. The electrons pass through to the cathode, where you have an oxidizer that's being reduced. A fuel cell has a constant supply of fuel that generates the electricity. So unlike other galvanic cells, like your typical batteries that you might have, like a battery like this, when the anode runs out, the battery stops working, whereas with a fuel cell, as long as you can provide fuel, then the electricity is supplied. So, advantages of fuel cells, they're much more efficient compared to steam turbines. A solid oxygen fuel cell can be about 60% efficient, so that's 3 times as efficient as a steam turbine might be. Again, there's no moving parts, even though we do have gases flowing through and things moving the electrolyte. There aren't any turbines moving, for example, and because there's no moving parts, that means there's less maintenance required. It's not reliant on weather. As long as you can provide the fuels, the electricity is produced. You can use a variety of fuels. Typically in the fuel cells you'll see they're using hydrogen, but you can use methanol, you can use ethanol in some fuel cells, even aluminium in some fuel cells you can use to produce electricity. The waste products produced in this fuel cell down here is just water, so water vapor comes out, and that's not necessarily going to cause huge environmental issues. Whereas with coal, at least you'll get sulfur, and with both coal and natural gas, when you burn those, you'll get carbon dioxide being produced. They both cause environmental issues, whereas with a fuel cell, that's not the case. Disadvantages of fuel cells, it's currently still an expensive technology. the fuel cells require an expensive catalyst, which I've said here, on at least the anode and normally on the cathode as well. So those catalysts are expensive and in short supply, so that makes the cost of the fuel cell much higher. If you're going to use hydrogen as your fuel, there's problems with hydrogen in terms of producing it, because it's often being produced from natural gas, which leads to it not being environmentally good, because you still produce carbon dioxide when you're making your hydrogen. Hydrogen is the smallest gas, so it's very hard to store it because it leaks out over time. And how do you transport hydrogen around to the fuel cells? It's a gas. If you want to liquefy it, it requires a very high pressure or a very low temperature. And the amount of hydrogen you can store in an area isn't great because of the amount of energy required to store it. So using hydrogen is problematic. So if you have a look at our car down here, it's got our fuel tank down here. And that fuel tank would be much bigger if you wanted to drive any kind of distance in the car. Depending on the fuel, so if you're using hydrogen, you just produce water, but if you're using methanol or ethanol, then you'll produce carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, we know, has global warming implications. Your fuel needs to be very clean, otherwise you can contaminate the electrodes, and if you contaminate the electrodes, the fuel cell doesn't work. So there's issues there as well. So today on Flippin Science, we compared energy sources. That's it for Flippin Science today. See ya.